In February 1943, the armed forces of the United States stood as masters of the Pacific island of Guadalcanal. This small jungle outpost had been virtually unknown 6 months before, but it was now a name familiar to the American public. The successful invasion of Guadalcanal by the Marines of General Alexander van der Grift had captured the national imagination, and the departure of the Japanese marked a turning point in the story of the Second World War. The seemingly relentless Japanese expansion was over, and it was now the task of America and her allies to roll back the frontiers of the empire. But it would be a long and costly enterprise. In February 1943, Japan remained in control of a vast area of the Pacific Ocean, and her forces were prepared to die to defend it. The Allies were already familiar with this powerful warrior spirit. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese defenders revealed their distaste for any idea of surrender. Death in battle was the only fitting end for a defeated imperial soldier. In the 2.5 years that followed, the same attitude showed itself across the Western Pacific, as the United States led her allies on an amazing journey from island to island towards the land of the rising sun itself. This was a period that saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war, at sea, in the air, and especially on land. The names of battlefields like Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa are now synonymous with close-quarter fighting of the bitterest kind. The Japanese desire to fight on to the end resulted in casualty lists of biblical proportions, and few were taken prisoner. The missions of Japanese kamikaze pilots have also come to typify the disregard for life amongst imperial fighting men. Even when the Allies had fought their way to the edge of Japan itself, it took the most deadly weapon ever created finally to bring the conflict to an end. The journey from Guadalcanal to Nagasaki remains one of the most revealing chapters in the history of warfare. The American triumph at Guadalcanal forced the Japanese Imperial Command to consider a new strategy for the prosecution of the Pacific War. 6 weeks after the Japanese withdrawal, the new approach was decided. In essence, it was a defensive strategy that aimed to secure control of key strongholds across a vast front line, while allowing for the possibility of a counterattack if the opportunity existed. March 1943 also saw the agreement of the Allied strategy for the conflict to come. At the Washington Pacific Conference, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to pursue a two-pronged attack through the many islands of the Western Pacific. The Southwest Pacific Command was given responsibility for an advance beginning at Guadalcanal, its task to sweep through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea towards the islands of the Philippines. In overall command, the charismatic Douglas MacArthur, the general who had famously sworn to return to the Philippines after the Japanese conquest of March 1942. To the north, the Central Pacific Area Command of Admiral Chester Nimitz was allocated the second thrust of the American offensive. This would involve a vast naval force advancing from island to island across thousands of kilometers of ocean, from the Gilbert Islands through the Marshalls and Carolines to the Marianas. Eventually, the two prongs of the offensive would converge for a final, unified assault on the island of Formosa, before moving against the islands of Japan itself. It was an audacious plan, but the vast amount of naval material required for Nimitz's objectives was still not available in early 1943. So it was the forces of Douglas MacArthur that began the task of pushing back the frontiers of the Japanese Empire. It would be an achievement of epic proportions. In the spring of 1943, the American Southwest Pacific Command considered its options for the task that now faced them. It was already obvious that the main Japanese stronghold in the region was the fortress of Rabaul on the island of New Britain. This was the headquarters of the Japanese 8th Area Army, a force of 100,000 fighting men. If Rabaul could be destroyed, then further progress towards the Philippines would become a far easier enterprise. By early May 1943, General MacArthur and his colleagues had determined their plan. MacArthur himself would lead an advance along the northeast coast of New Guinea, driving the Japanese back before crossing over to New Britain. At the same time, his deputy, Admiral William Bull Halsey, would lead an invasion force from Guadalcanal through the Solomon Islands so that Rabaul could be attacked from two sides. The operation was given the code name Cartwheel, and on the 30th of June, 1943, the fight back in the Pacific began. That day, the 43rd American Infantry Division took to their landing craft for an assault on the Solomon Island of Rendova. The island was lightly defended, and 2 days later, the American troops were able to land on the island of New Georgia. Their objective was now the Japanese airfield at Munda. It was just 10 kilometers away, but it would take a month of bitter fighting before American troops secured the position. A massive artillery barrage was required, but not even the power of the 155mm howitzer shells could force the Japanese to abandon Munda. It took the intervention of American air power and reinforcements on the ground before the airfield was finally taken. This was an inauspicious beginning to the eastern thrust of Operation Cartwheel. Admiral Halsey knew that there were far more substantial Japanese positions located at Kolonbangara, and especially Bougainville. This was the headquarters of the 17th Army of General Harukichi Hyakutake, a veteran of the Guadalcanal fighting. But the American commander proved equal to the challenge. Much to the surprise of Hyakutake, Halsey ordered that Kolonbangara should be bypassed. Instead, he dispatched American and New Zealander troops to the more lightly defended island of Vella La Vella. 2 months later, in early November, Halsey also achieved tactical surprise by launching his attack on Bougainville from the west. General Hyakutake had not anticipated a landing in this swamp region, but by the time he scrambled his forces in response, the American Marines were establishing a bridgehead on the island. With this achieved, the Japanese commander was never able to regain the initiative, and Bougainville eventually fell on November the 26th. The eastern objectives of Operation Cartwheel had now been fully achieved. To the west, General MacArthur had also enjoyed considerable success. On the vast jungle island of New Guinea, Allied troops had been at grips with the enemy well before the attack in the Solomon Islands. Early in 1943, an Australian garrison at Wau had been engaged in a bitter fight to hold the position in the face of a keen Japanese assault. Only a last-minute airborne reinforcement of troops had saved the Australians from defeat, and the Japanese offensive was finally abandoned at the end of February. It had been a bloody engagement. 200 Australians lost their lives in bitter close-quarter jungle fighting. But 1,200 Japanese also died at Wau, and by spring 1943, the Australian troops of General Savage's 3rd Division were ready to play their part in support of Operation Cartwheel. On April the 26th, the Australian men left their base at Wau and set off towards the coast. Their destination was a position near to the Japanese base at Salamoa. It was a journey of just 55 kilometers to the east, but it would take 2 months to cover the ground. The jungle was virtually impenetrable, and the Australians also had to contend with enemy outposts deep in the rainforest. It was the 29th of June before the exhausted units eventually arrived at the coast. But they had achieved their objective. Australian troops now joined together with a landing party of American infantry to attack Japanese positions at Suramoa and Leyte. Despite a vigorous defense, by the 11th of September, the Japanese were retreating into the mountains in the face of the combined Allied attack. By the 22nd of September, Australian forces had arrived at the Japanese base of Finschhafen. But the site was deserted. The Japanese now chose to concentrate their resources in the regions of Sattleburg, and it took another bloody engagement before this stronghold fell on the 25th of November 1943. But victory at Sattleburg meant that the western thrust of Operation Cartwheel had also completed its objective. The next day, some 800 kilometers to the east, American Marines completed the capture of Bougainville, and the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul was now under threat from two sides, as planned. But MacArthur and his colleagues had already realized that an assault on the Japanese Eighth Army was unnecessary. Simply isolating it would be enough. It was a far less costly approach.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
After establishing a defensive position on southern New Britain, early in 1944, American and New Zealand troops moved to capture the small islands to the north. The Rabaul base was effectively surrounded, and 100,000 troops found themselves cut off from the war. With this achieved, MacArthur's American forces moved against the northern coast of New Guinea. On the 22nd of April 1944, an amphibious landing of some 80,000 men arrived at the Japanese stronghold of Hollandia, only to find it abandoned. The Japanese presence on the island was now in retreat, and with the Rabaul base cut off, there was little that their commanders could do to halt the Allied progress, despite the best efforts of their men on the ground. By the 15th of September, a delighted Douglas MacArthur was able to report his arrival on the island of Morotai. The Philippines were now within striking distance. MacArthur's promise that he would return to the islands was now on the point of being realized, and the Pacific War as a whole was going to plan. In late 1943, far away in the Gilbert Islands, the men of Admiral Nimitz began their journey across the Central Pacific. But this first step gave Nimitz and his colleagues a hint of what lay ahead on the path to victory. On the 20th of November 1943, American Marines launched an amphibious assault on the island of Tarawa. Within days, the American public knew that victory in the Pacific would come at a price. Tarawa was a tiny objective, an island just 3 kilometers in length, but it took the loss of 1,000 American troops to capture it. Many of these men never reached the shore. Survivors recalled one Japanese machine gunner who trained his weapon on the opening bow doors of the American landing craft. For those troops caught in his line of fire, there was little chance of survival. Not for the last time, the warm shore waters of the Pacific Ocean were filled with the bodies of the dead. Tarawa was a taste of things to come. When the Japanese guns eventually fell silent, the island air was filled with the smell of death. Only 17 of the 4,200 Japanese defenders were taken alive. Prisoners of war would be a rare phenomenon during the Pacific conflict. For the vast majority of Japanese fighting men, surrender to the enemy was an option filled with shame. It was quite literally a fate worse than death, and it is this that provides the main explanation for the tiny numbers of war prisoners taken in the Pacific. But there was also another reason. For the Allies, taking Japanese prisoners could be a risky business. At Guadalcanal, American troops had discovered the fanaticism of their enemy. Many commanders reported occasions when a wounded Japanese came forward in apparent surrender. When an American Marine went to attend to his defeated adversary, the Japanese pulled the pin on a suicide grenade that also killed his captor. From Guadalcanal onwards, American forces remained wary of taking any prisoners alive, a concern that goes some way towards explaining the appalling death rolls that characterized the Pacific War. But the slaughter at Tarawa was still a shock to the American public in 1943, and Admiral Nimitz was determined to learn any lessons that he could from the carnage. For his next objective, the Marshall Island of Kwajalein, the American commander did everything in his power to minimize the Japanese threat before his ground troops attacked. A 3-day bombardment from the ships and carrier planes of American Task Force 58 was launched against Kwajalein before American infantrymen went ashore on February 1, 1944. But as Nimitz must have suspected, not even this could neuter the fighting spirit of the individual Japanese soldier. On the 4th of February, the American commander was informed that Kwajalein had finally been taken. 173 men of his 7th Infantry Division had lost their lives. 4,938 Japanese had shared their fate. Even when the battle was all but lost, the soldier of the Japanese Empire refused to surrender, and it was left to American flamethrower units to complete the grim conquest of Kwajalein. A similar loss of life was also reported on the Marshall Island atoll of Eniwetok. Here the Japanese lost all but 64 of 2,700 men by the time the island was taken on the 21st of February. Again, an initial bombardment by American naval and air forces contributed to the death toll, but as on Kwajalein, it was a much closer kind of combat that finally secured the capture of the island. It was now clear to Nimitz and his fellow commanders that the deployment of ground troops had to be a measure of last resort. If strategic objectives could be attained without face-to-face fighting, then that would be the favoured option. Douglas MacArthur recognized this when he decided not to attack the stronghold of Rabaul. In February 1944, Admiral Nimitz came to a similar decision concerning the Japanese naval base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. The physical capture of the island was not essential. Instead, Nimitz ordered a massive 2-day air assault beginning on the 17th of February 1944. 9 waves of Hellcat fighters, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Dauntless dive bombers transformed a paradise island into a scene of carnage. Of the 275 Japanese aircraft situated on Truk, just 1 was left in operation by the end of the so-called Operation Hailstone. With Truk now effectively isolated, Nimitz was able to proceed to his next objectives in the Mariana Islands. By now, American industrial strength was securing a strategic advantage in the war. In June 1944, Nimitz's deputy, Admiral Raymond Spruance, stood in command of a task force whose complement of aircraft carriers alone totaled 15, on board a total of 900 warplanes. The Japanese leadership knew that the balance of materials was turning against them. They also knew that the loss of the Marianas would be a catastrophe for the Empire. If the islands were lost, Japan itself would be within range of the heavy American bombers. When the first amphibious landing was made on Saipan on June the 15th, the Imperial Navy was given the task of making a desperate strike against the huge American fleet. Vice Admiral Yosiburo Ozawa now took command of a task force comprising 55 warships, including 9 carriers with 473 aircraft. These included the Zero fighter that the Americans had first encountered at Pearl Harbor and which remains one of the most famous warplanes of the 20th century. But by mid-1944, the legendary Zero found itself outclassed by the American Hellcat, and when Vice Admiral Ozawa dispatched his first wave of aircraft in the direction of the Marianas on June 19, 1944, he must have suspected the likely outcome. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of the Japanese ability to wage carrier warfare in the Pacific. The American task force stationed to the northwest of Guam not only possessed better aircraft, they also possessed every detail of the enemy plan of attack, having succeeded in cracking the Japanese code system. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched 4 successive waves against the American fleet. It became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In just 3 hours of air combat, a total of 243 Japanese warplanes were lost. Only 30 American craft shared their fate. But the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not yet over. Despite his losses, Vice Admiral Ozawa was keen to re-engage the enemy after making a tactical withdrawal. The American Task Force commander, Mark Mitcher, was also willing to continue the fight. When his reconnaissance planes located the Japanese fleet on the afternoon of June the 20th, Mitcher ordered his Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses into the air, even though their objective was at the absolute limit of their range. When the American aircraft arrived, the result was another bitter blow for the Japanese, with the carrier Hio sent to the bottom by a twin torpedo attack. But the engagements of the 20th of June 1944 were not entirely one-sided. 100 American aircraft were also lost, some of them in combat. A far greater number forced to ditch at sea after running out of fuel on the way back to the carriers. Despite this, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was a triumph for the Americans, and in Tokyo, the loss of so many Japanese aircraft forced the resignation of the Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo. The Allied assault on the Marianas could now continue without interference from the air. By July the 7th, the major objective of Saipan had been achieved, though here, once again, the occupying ground forces revealed a fanatical desire to fight to the end. On the last day of fighting, the Japanese commander Yoshitsugu Saito ordered a final infantry charge into a line of American artillery and machine gun fire. 3,000 men died, including their commander, by the ritual suicide of harakiri. With the fall of Saipan, the end began to loom for the once mighty Japanese Empire. By the end of July 1944, the Marianas were an American possession, and Japan now faced the menace of long-range strategic bombing by the B-29 Super Fortress. In August 1945, it was also from a Marianas airfield that the most devastating bomber raid of all was launched. But a year earlier, the American High Command was still dependent on conventional weaponry as the Pacific offensive continued. By the late summer of 1944, the twin thrust strategy had forced the Japanese to retreat across a vast area of territory. But the American leadership now had to consider the next steps towards the islands of Japan. Originally, the intention had been for the forces of MacArthur and Nimitz to converge on the southern Philippines and push toward the island of Formosa before heading north. But it was well known that MacArthur favoured the capture of the entire Philippine chain, and when his deputy, Admiral Halsey, reported only light Japanese defences in the south of the Philippines during a raid in September 1944, President Roosevelt decided to modify the American Pacific strategy. MacArthur would be responsible for liberating the Philippines, while Nimitz would head northwest towards Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the fringes of Japan itself. The Pacific War was still far from over. With Japanese defences in the southern Philippines apparently light, MacArthur decided to bypass the island of Mindanao and make his landing in the centre of the country. On the 20th of October 1944, in an emotional homecoming, Douglas MacArthur once again set foot on Philippine soil as his amphibious landing force secured their beachhead. MacArthur could take confidence in the naval force that defended him, the American 3rd and 7th Fleets, a total of 800 ships. And this vast armada soon found itself involved in the largest naval battle that the world has ever seen, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As soon as the Japanese Imperial Command received news of MacArthur's landing, they made the decision to deploy their naval forces in a final attempt to stem the American advance. In overall command, the Tokyo-based Admiral Soimo Toyoda. At sea, Admiral Takeo Kurita took charge. And it was this 55-year-old commander who almost pulled off a famous victory. Kurita's plan was to engage the American fleet positioned to the east of the Philippines in support of the landings at Leyte. 39 warships would attack from the west in a two-prong pincer, but Kurita also deployed another decoy carrier group in the direction of the northeast. This was a force that was superficially strong. 17 vessels, including 4 aircraft carriers under the command of Admiral Yosiburo Ozawa. But there were virtually no aircraft on board. The whole group was a sacrificial offering, intended to lure Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet away from its position in support of the Leyte landings. And the American commander took the bait. On the 24th and 25th of October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded. For the Japanese, the results were initially mixed. Although the US carrier Princeton was destroyed in a dive bomber attack, American aircraft succeeded in destroying the huge Japanese battleship, the Musashi. Worse still, the southern half of Kurita's pincer found itself trapped overnight in the narrow Surigao Strait, where its vessels were wiped out by the big American naval guns. But Admiral Kurita's northern group remained intact, having made a tactical nighttime withdrawal to the San Bernardino Strait, and the American 3rd Fleet was now sailing away from this main Japanese deployment. During the afternoon of October the 24th, Admiral Halsey was informed of what appeared to be the main Japanese attack force. The commander already revelled in the nickname Bull Halsey because of his habit of making immediate charges on the enemy, and now he lived up to his reputation. By ordering his fleet to sail north, he left the 7th Fleet of Admiral Kinkaid exposed, and in the morning, Admiral Kurita sailed into Leyte Gulf to face a drastically weakened force. The decoy plan had worked. Kurita's battle group now engaged the American battle group known as Taffy 3, and Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague found himself outnumbered. 3 of his destroyers were sunk. The carrier Gambler Bay also went down, as the American ships maneuvered desperately to escape Kurita's attack. Appeals for help were sent to the departed Halsey in the north, but it was only when Admiral Nimitz himself intervened that the Third Fleet finally turned around. Halsey had been fooled, and his fleet was still unable to assist his colleagues. The American landings on Leyte were in real danger. But now the Japanese commander made a mistake of his own. Uncertain of the size of the American force that faced him, Admiral Kurita decided to withdraw. The Americans could hardly believe it. Their landings on the Philippines were secure. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf had one final sting in the tail. On the evening of the 25th of October, the American 7th Fleet was attacked by a new kind of weapon from the air. Obsolete aircraft, packed with explosives and piloted by young Japanese men fully aware that they would die in the course of their mission. These were the pilots of the so-called Divine Wind, the Kamikaze. And it was at Leyte Gulf that the Americans first felt the power of the suicide bombers. In the months that followed, a total of 40 American ships were destroyed by this unsettling weapon of last resort, and thousands of lives were lost in the process. If there were any lingering doubts about the willingness of the Japanese to die for their country, the introduction of the kamikaze removed them once and for all. Despite this, the American bridgehead on the Philippines was secure by the end of October 1944, and there could be no doubt in Tokyo that the war was now a lost cause. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had wiped out the Japanese power in the air, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the final effective appearance of the Imperial Navy. But the fanatical resistance of Japanese ground troops continued, and it was this that led the United States to consider the use of terrifying new weapons, finally to bring the war to its end. The fighting for the Philippines typified the Japanese desire to fight on to the death. Tens of thousands of defending troops lost their lives by the time the capital, Manila, fell in early March 1945. Tragically, 100,000 citizens also died before Douglas MacArthur could fulfill his promise to return to the Philippine capital. Bitter, close-quarter fighting continued in the Philippines right up till the end of the war, as MacArthur initiated a series of amphibious landings to retake all of the islands. As late as September 1945, pockets of Japanese resistance continued to hold out, with no thought of surrender. But the battle for the Philippines had effectively ended earlier in the year, as the attention of the American public turned to the progress of Admiral Nimitz's force in the northwest, with the greatest interest in the outcome of 2 amphibious island invasions, operations that, more than anything, persuaded the American leadership to turn to the ultimate weapon to bring the war to an end. By February 1945, bombing raids on the Japanese home islands had become commonplace, but the B-29s taking off from airfields in the Marianas still lacked effective fighter protection. The island of Iwo Jima could provide a base for American fighters, and so the decision was made to make an amphibious assault on Iwo Jima beginning in February 1945. It would be the first of two amphibious assaults that would be amongst the bloodiest episodes of the entire Second World War. On February the 19th, 1945, American Marines began their arrival on the beaches of Iwo Jima, and it seemed at first as if their task would be a simple one. The island had been subjected to a ferocious bombing campaign, and the landing troops encountered nothing in the way of resistance on the shores. But it was a very different story inland. Under the command of Tadamichi Kurabayashi, a total of 21,000 men had dug themselves into deep defensive positions, with the peak of Mount Suribachi a focus for the defense. Within hours of landing, the American Marines realized that these soldiers would have to be flushed out almost one by one, with explosives and flamethrowers often proving more effective than infantry or artillery fire. Predictably, it was a terrifying task. The Marines had to engage an enemy for whom death was the greatest honor attainable in battle. Soon, the smell of slaughter filled the air as the assault on Mount Suribachi began. To add to the unsettling nature of the task, the offshore American fleet found itself attacked by the Kamikaze as the land fighting continued. At times, the American advance was slowed almost to a halt by the tenacity of the Japanese defense. But on the morning of the 23rd of February, 4 days into the assault, the Stars and Stripes flew from the highest point of Iwo Jima. It remains one of the most striking images of the Second World War. Even as the flag was being raised, American construction battalions had begun the task of building new airstrips, as the Japanese resistance slowly drew to its inevitable end. By the end of March, American victory on Iwo Jima was complete, and a vital new airbase was in full service. But the price had been high. 6,800 United States servicemen died in the battle for Iwo Jima. All but 200 of the 21,000 Japanese lost their lives. In the subsequent fighting for the island of Okinawa, the death toll was even higher. In a virtually identical operation, the American dead alone totaled 15,500. 80,000 Japanese shared their fate, along with 42,000 civilians. It was a horrific outcome. But for many Americans, it was the Japanese tactics at Okinawa that were more unsettling than the statistics of death rolls. On April the 7th, the American offshore fleet was attacked by the biggest ever kamikaze attack. Some 350 pilots, flying aircraft packed with explosives, descended from the sky and aimed their planes at the American ships. And this was just the first of many kamikaze raids on the American fleet at Okinawa. By the time the island was eventually taken after 12 weeks of fighting, some 32 vessels had been lost to the kamikaze, and 5,000 seamen lost their lives. Many Americans found the very idea of suicide bombing disturbing. They wondered what kind of enemy they were dealing with. The Japanese were now desperate to try any tactic that might make an impact, no matter what the cost in lives. On the same day as the first big kamikaze raid at Okinawa, a flotilla of 10 Japanese warships arrived on the scene. This was all that was left of a once proud navy, and it included the 64,000-ton Yamato, the biggest battleship ever built. But the Yamato's journey to Okinawa would be its last. Like the other ships, it was only given fuel for a one-way journey. The Japanese High Command knew the fate that awaited their pitiful fleet, but they were prepared for the loss of life if it could hamper the American invasion in any way. As events transpired, the monster Yamato made no impact at all. With all remaining Japanese fighters deployed in support of the kamikaze attack, the vessel was left as an easy target for American bombs and torpedoes. In less than an hour, 3 waves of attack sent the Yamato to the bottom, long before she reached Okinawa. It was as devastating as it was predictable, and it was typical of Japanese tactics in the face of defeat. There can be no doubt that the slaughter on Iwo Jima and on Okinawa had a deep impact on the thinking of the American leadership. The likely loss of American lives in a full-scale invasion of Japan could only be guessed at, if, as seemed likely, the enemy was prepared to fight to the death. But in the early months of 1945, another option began to grow in favor. From November 1944 onwards, the Japanese home islands received regular visits from American bomber squadrons. But in early 1945, the commander of 21st American Bomber Command conceived a devastating new strategy to force the ordinary Japanese citizen to accept that the war was lost. On the evening of the 9th of March, General Curtis LeMay gave the order for a very different kind of bombing raid from anything that had gone before. That night, 280 US bombers took off on a low-level mission against the very center of Japanese power, Tokyo itself. Their cargo, 2,000 tons of incendiary devices. American planners knew that the Japanese capital was built largely of wood, and a concentrated attack using napalm bombs could produce a terrible impact on the city. Their analysis proved accurate. On the night of the 10th March, 1945, Tokyo was set ablaze. The cumulative effect of the napalm devices rendered futile any attempts to extinguish the fires that engulfed the city. For a time, the atmosphere itself took light, and as many as 100,000 citizens may have perished as a result of one bombing raid. It was an overwhelming display of force. But if the American leadership hoped that such an enormous loss of life would bring their Japanese counterparts to the negotiating table, they were wrong. Although Japan was now hopelessly defeated as a military power, the war carried on, and the hellscape of Okinawa was still to come. By July 1945, many American citizens were resigned to the prospect of an invasion of Japan, an enterprise whose potential cost in lives could hardly be overestimated. But the American leadership was now in a position to finish the war in the most dramatic manner possible. For years, Allied scientists had been working in secret on a new kind of weapon, a bomb with a destructive power like nothing ever seen before, the atomic bomb. On July the 16th, 1945, at a site in the deserts of New Mexico, the new weapon was tested for the first time, and its power was obvious. With the atomic bomb, the United States could at last force the Japanese to accept their defeat. On the 6th of August, 1945, an American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, took off from a Marianas airfield. It flew at a height of 31,000 feet over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:16 a.m. local time, an atomic weapon was released into the Japanese sky. 43 seconds later, the atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima, and as many as 80,000 people died in an instant. Now, the Japanese leadership knew that their country could be completely destroyed at virtually no cost to their American enemies. Following the second atomic attack on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, the Japanese High Command accepted the inevitable, and the formal surrender of Japanese forces was soon a reality. World War II was over. But it had been a long, hard, and in the end, terrifying enterprise. Beginning at Guadalcanal, the Americans and their allies had forced their way across a vast area of the planet's surface. With every engagement, they encountered the remarkable spirit of the Japanese fighting man. In the end, it was the superior industrial and technological might of the United States that gained victory in the Pacific. But it was a triumph that had to be secured on the ground, on some of the bloodiest battlefields of the Second World War.